our purpose for today, structure and foot scoring. And our purpose here today is to understand foot scoring and the importance of structural differences. We're going to outline the foot scoring system and how to collect phenotypes, and then discuss the information and how it can be utilized. And again, I'm Alex Talbert, Regional Manager. I've got Jeff Mayfie over there is going to go over this, and Kelly Ritalik will be on the EPD side of things. And kind of a roadmap, the introduction, why we would discuss this, why we take time out of convention to talk about foot scoring and structure, and why it's important to us as Angus producers, as beef cattle producers, and then get into the foot scoring, the process of foot scoring, where you do it, at what age do you do it, and then the procedure, actually scoring the feet, turning them in. And then there at the end, we'll go over the EPDs, and kind of where we are in terms of that research and data collection, and then how do I use it at home once we have that EPD established. And the first thing I start out with is why. I don't know about you guys, but when I was in school, especially as I got older, I had a hard time just sitting down and learning something if I didn't understand why in the world I needed to do this. And I think that's a good thing for me, because once I figure out the why, I have more passion about learning how. And this is a quote that I use a lot when I speak to commercial producers. I use it when I speak to purebred producers, because it kind of gives us a little purpose and gives us why. The seed stock industry exists as a business to meet the needs of the commercial cattlemen. And I use that to tell commercial cattlemen to let them know that they're important. Without them, we don't have a business. But at the same time, I use this quote to remind us as purebred breeders and purebred producers that we have a large responsibility. Those commercial cattlemen depend on us. They depend on the seed stock that we make and we're selling them, and they depend on us to make a good product that'll last long, and a good product that will improve their herd from not just a longevity standpoint, but a performance and production standpoint. So I think it is upon us as purebred breeders that we carry that responsibility, and I think that's the real responsibility we have today in looking at structure of animals and the foot structure in particular of animals and how that applies to longevity. Longevity in the cow herd, but even longevity in the terminal end of cattle going in a feedlot, because they have to perform and they have to maintain a level of performance to be successful for that end product guy. So what is structure? I've given just kind of a brief definition here. You can Google it just as easy as I did. A skeletal structure designed to support, and I emphasize support, or enclose something. And that second point, a frame or structure composed of parts fitted together. And I like that one, support one. And when I think about structure personally, I think about it like building a house, and especially in regards to the cattle that we look at and we care for on a daily basis. That foundation is so pivotal, and it's the foundation of the animal. We have to start there. But even the framework, you think about building a house, the rafters and those things are just as important as the foundation and the longevity of that structure. And that's kind of what it is, and I always break it down. Well, where do I see it? And these pictures, if you guys have been in here, they're probably older than I am. But I think it's important sometimes that we just kind of go back and remember the basics of cattle evaluation, the basics of what we're trying to do. And so from the front view of an animal, this is a good view of structure. We've got the one on the be my right, your left, that's termed normal, or I would call that ideal. We look at the column of bones there on the front leg that's very straight up and down, and then we even look at how that relates to where that foot sits down on the ground, very nice and square. We move over to the next one, and we see then they've got those lines drawn in there, one that's in at its knee, and then when we see that the feet kind of splay out. And when Jeff gets talking about his portion of the feet, it's very interesting to see. But when we see one in at their knee, you can kind of see that their weight is distributed on a different part of the foot, and how that would relate to wear and tear, even if you think about the tires that you have on your car. And then this one at the very end, one that's bow-legged, their knees are out, and the way that they would stand typically would turn their toes in. And you think about the different places each of these animals would wear on their feet as they move. And you think about the pressure of the weight distribution on those joints as those cattle move and as they grow and develop, and especially as they get to heavier weights. The impact that can have. Again, they go over the side view there on the top one, a correct set to a hind leg, one that is too straight in its hock and upright. Think about the impact that can have on the joints and the ease of mobility. And then we have another one there at the end that's sickle hock, and you can see even there, and Jeff will get into that, how that pastern is starting to get a little weaker and the impacts of that. And then as we get behind there, you can see that structure of the leg down the hock, the correct one, or one we would term ideal, bow-legged in the middle, and then one on the very right there, and one that's cow-hocked. And again, bring that up, you see the differences. And then we think about the impact of those differences on weight distribution of the animal and even on the foot and the wear and tear of the foot. And where do we see it here? I've got a picture of a live animal, one that the profile, I guess, as me as an evaluator of livestock, a lot of the differences that I see in structure, I evaluate on the profile. And we'll look there. Let's see if I've got my pointer with me. See if I can make this work. Right here, kind of as I view, the first thing I'm going to look kind of the top of the shoulder, down here to the point of the shoulder, and then how that goes right down into the knee. And I've got some arrows drawn there. And we're looking for a gradual slope, kind of almost a 45-degree angle there. And what we're doing, we're trying to distribute that weight evenly among the joints and the skeletal frame of that animal. And as we think about that, again, relating that to longevity. And then we look at the hook and the pin bones there and their hip and making that long and level. And that sets up kind of the framework for underneath. And we draw that line there to kind of look at the set, that hock. And from the side, we like that set and flex to that female's hock. As I view her from the side, I have an idea in my mind how she's going to move. I have an idea in my mind even how she's going to set down on her feet. And that's one that I think as we view and we look at those things, that's an animal that I would say is one to keep in your mind to being something that's nice. Again, the same thing on the bull. Again, just bringing up a bull, we see the angle there to his shoulder. He's probably a bit more upright than the female. Again, from that down into its knee, again, the hip, and then how that relates to the hock. This one's probably the bull a bit more straight in his hock than the female is. And so again, what I always ask, what's that got to do with the price of rice in China? What's that got to do with me? And again, to me, it gets back to providing that seed stock that the commercial cow guy, he can depend on. Having animals that can last, that are built to last, that's my responsibility to him, along with performance, along with meat, muscle, all those other things. This is something else that I think I owe him, is trying to build something that's right structurally. And the significance to that, to him and his pocketbook, is those females lasting longer in production. And then you think about, again, those end users. We don't need cattle for the feedlot that are breaking down before they're done. And then again, I go back to our responsibility as seed stock producers, again, to provide that product that's got some longevity and some long-term. And I guess next I'll turn this over to Jeff. And before he starts, I would ask, how many of you guys in the crowd have scored feet? Got a few? How many of you have seen the material? Got a few more. And anybody in here this is the first time you've seen material and never thought about it? Good. Well, that's why we brought Jeff in today. He's going to tell you all about it. Jeff?
Thank you, Alex. Good job. And really my portion of this is going to be just to discuss taking those phenotypes and collecting that data and that information. You've probably seen these guidelines if you've taken foot scores, and I hate to bore you with this. I know a lot of you know this information, but for those of you that this is new to, just a handful of guidelines suggested from AGI and the association. Obviously, don't trick yourself. Score those animals before you trim their feet, or if you were going to trim their feet. When you do put a score in, we're going to evaluate all 4 feet independently and assign the worst score to each foot, or pick the worst foot and put that score. For 2 scores, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. And then, of course, the recommendation, the earliest you can score the bulls and the heifers is both the same at 320 days. Older females can be scored, and we'll talk about the importance maybe of some repeatability and possibly doing those females twice, maybe as a yearling or as a bred heifer, and then again as a young cow, because I think those of you that have taken some of this data certainly understand the changes that go on during that female's lifetime, and that helps to document some longevity as well. And of course, very accepting of older bull data as well. If you guys market bulls at 18 to 20 months of age, it's a good time. So we're going to put 2 scores, assign 2 scores as we evaluate an individual animal. Those scores range from 1 to 9. 5 is ideal for foot angle. 5 would also be ideal for the second score, claw set, or the shape to their hoof. There's quite a bit of variation from 1 to 9 when we look at foot angle, but I think it's important to maybe talk a little bit about foot angle and what's actually comprised of that. There's really probably 3 different things that you're looking at or evaluating when you're looking at foot angle. 1, the length of the toe. 2, the depth of the heel depth, and the set to their pastern, or where their angle is to their pastern. So there's really kind of 3 traits we're looking at foot angle. And it's all kind of lumped into one score. You can see that 5 and 6 are pretty ideal. You can see that there's some depth of heel in 5 and 6 as you compare it to 9. We don't see a lot of 1s and 2s in Angus cattle, but it's on there if there is some. And then, of course, as we get into the claw set, you can see that 5's pretty much ideal and 6 is plenty acceptable. Questions to this point? Anyone? Okay. Some other recommendations, just some references in the field as far as helping people turn this information in or collect the information. You know, I think ideally those feet need to be evaluated on some sort of hard surface, whether it's a scraped alley or some type of concrete alley. It gives you a good chance to evaluate what you really have. This dirt out here in the arena, it's acceptable, but it's probably a little looser than what I would really prefer. Again, we're going to look at all 4 feet independently. Some folks ask, you know, can you score them in a chute? And I think you can get by looking at their claw set or their shape to their foot. In a chute, I know a lot of people just drop the chute doors, the bottom doors, and they'll take a couple steps back and they'll look at if there's any curl or how symmetrical those toes are. But I don't think you can evaluate their heel depth very well when they're standing in a chute and they're not necessarily naturally standing. So we've got some producers that'll look at the shape to their feet in a chute. They'll let them out and they'll put a second score on in terms of their foot angle and their heel depth. Again, the bulls, just to reiterate, you've probably got one time to capture that data. And then on the females, I think it's important to look at possibly doing those females twice in their lifetime, maybe as a yearling and then again as a young female in production. So with that, we've got some examples of some cattle we have here, and I realize it's not, you can't see them very well out here, so we've got some pictures that Alex would have shot last week, and it'll kind of help you work through these just a little bit. And then I'd welcome any of you guys later if you want to come down and look at these. But as a group, we'll kind of work through 5 of these heifers and score them. So we're going to start with the number 1 heifer. And we've actually got a picture as she's coming out here of what her toes look like in that claw set. We think back to that chart that ranges from 1 to 9 when we look at that claw set. that's closer to a 9. And really, if we were going to match or mentally think about where she's going to land out as far as a score, I'd probably write down an 8 for a claw set there. So again, these heifers are bred heifers, going to calve in the spring, and so about an 8 is what I would assign there on that claw set. There's the claw set again, just another picture of it. We did not get a picture of her foot angle, but I think out here looking at her foot angle, it's still pretty acceptable. She's got a little set to her pastern. Her heel depth, though it's a little harder to see in this looser surface that we have, it's probably adequate, and I would probably score her a 6 on the set to her pastern or her foot angle, and then I'd have an 8 wrote down for her claw set. Okay? For our second heifer, we're going to look at number 2. Yes, and what we showed you a picture. No, you're just going to put whatever that poorest foot is, that's going to be the score.
You don't say which one.
Not which one, no.
On the set, you do the same thing. You rank the poorest one.
Yes, yes. The question was asked on both traits, foot angle and claw set, do you rank the poorest one or write down whichever the poorest of those 4 feet are? And yes, the answer is correct. Whichever 4, I mean, it may be her front left hoof. There's quite a bit of variation. So, on number 2, again, when we look at foot angle first here, I don't have a pointer with me, but that's close to a 45-degree angle to her pastern, maybe slightly just a little straighter than a 45. The length of toe on this heifer is okay, but I think where you would improve her would be a little more heel depth, and you can see that hairline's real close to the ground. And again, and so we think about that, and you're putting those 3 things together to get a foot angle score. I'm going to probably rate that heifer at about a 6 is what I'm going to write down. When we look at the claw set of her, those feet aren't bad. I mean, there's a little bit of turn, just slight bit of turn to her toes. And, I'd say her feet are fairly acceptable. She'd be right there in that 5-6 category. I wouldn't argue if you wrote down a 5. I wouldn't argue if you wrote down a 6. Now, the interesting thing on this heifer, if you look at that inside claw, is that going to continue to grow? And so, do we want to go ahead and document another score when she's 2 or 3 years of age? I'd probably say yes. Okay? We're going to move on to the next female. We're going to get the number 5 female here. As we look at foot angle there, this is a pretty classic example of something I would consider ideal. She's right there at about a 45, maybe a little more upright, and I'd say that's going to be right at a 5. There's good depth of heel to that, and her toe looks about like it needs to in terms of sitting underneath her correctly. And everything kind of matches. So in terms of foot angle, I would rate her, or I'd score her a 5. In terms of the shape to her foot, the claw set, and this is probably the best footed heifer we have as we compare the cattle together. But that heifer has got just a little turn between those toes. I would write down a 6. Okay. Moving on to number 4. The number 4 heifer, just okay in terms of heel depth. You can see that those toes are a little longer than they need to be in terms of her foot angle. And so, that heifer, I would probably score her a 7. They're going to bring her out of here in just a minute as far as foot angle. And there's another picture of that. Those toes are pretty long, and it doesn't mean they're curling over at this point, but there's some length to her feet. Okay? One other thing to notice on this heifer, and we don't have a picture of her front feet. I think that was a back foot that he took. But this heifer is starting to kind of knee in, like Alex talked about earlier. She's really in at her front knee, and she puts that weight on her inside toe. And so naturally, those inside toes on her front feet, if you can see her standing right there, they're starting to turn outward. And I think we're probably dealing with a little different situation, more of her skeleton causing some foot issues there. But she's longer toed than she needs to be, and so that would be where I would want to fix that heifer. And then our final heifer, number 3, we can see an adequate degree of depth of heel there. The shape or the length of that toe is fine, and then the set to that pastern, I would have her at about a 5 in terms of foot angle. As far as see where we, and then in terms of the claw set, again, not a lot of turn there, pretty even set of toes, not a bad-footed heifer, and I'd have her right there about a 5 as well. And so I realize this is tough data to collect. It's not easy. I prefer to do cattle one at a time in an alley, and have somebody bring them to you in a scraped alley. It seems like it can go pretty quick doing that, and you can get some confidence built as you match, these scores in your mind and start to write those scores down a little quicker. The other thing, I think it's important to have some repeated measures relative to the females to start to document some longevity and what those feet are really doing. Obviously, management in environment's going to play a role in what those feet look like compared to others, but I truly believe, feet can last in a lot of different environments, and so you're going to record that management code. These cattle are going to be in their contemporary group and things of that nature. But with that said, I think we may hold the questions to the end. I'm going to turn this over to Kelly, and she's going to talk to you a little bit more about the EPD and the research in terms of where they're at.
Well, thanks, Jeff. When we start looking at these from a genetic evaluation standpoint, obviously we always want to be able to collect variation. And so Jeff and Alex both talked a lot about being able to collect these scores on older females, being able to collect these, your large groups of bulls at the latest age that you possibly can. Why do we need to do that? We need to do that because we can see more variation, right? We start to see more variation and more spread on that bell curve. Because the reality is when we do genetic analysis and we do EPDs, we're not going to have a lot of spread in our EPDs if we don't have a lot of spread in our data, right? And so we want to make sure that we're capturing these at different age points. And one of the goals this summer that we had at the association was a board of directors initiative was to actually capture phenotypes on mature females. So last year, if you were here at Angus Convention, you probably heard me talk about all the work we did on our yearling foot scores. We found that these foot scores were heritable. We found that this data was able to be analyzed, and we were actually able to make genetic progress with something like foot structure and with these two individual scores. And I put up this graph of basically the distribution that we have in our yearling aged animals. Okay, so if you look at that bar right in the middle, that 5 is ideal. We don't have a whole lot of spread in this data, do we? We had a lot of 5s, we had a few 6s, some 7s, really no 1, 2, 3, or 4s. We still don't see a lot of that 1 through 4 data in our mature data sets. But for both foot angle and claw set at yearling ages, right, it's hard for us to pick up variation. And so we went out and we scored a bunch of mature cow data, and right now we have about 5,000 records collected in there. About 2,200 of them are being used in the evaluation today. And you can see that we've shifted this bell curve quite a bit, right? Those blue and red bars over top of that 5 have gone down drastically, right? Because we're picking up more variation when we score these older females. And so we have a lot more 6s, a few more 7s. We're actually starting to see some 8s and 9s. But I do want to point out again, the 1 through 4 scores, we're not seeing those females with divergent toes, right? Or that are really straight through their knees. you guys as producers have kind of taken care of those types of issues, and we don't see them in Angus cattle very often. And so with this data, what happens is that we can make a lot more accurate EPD predictions because we see more variation in these two particular data sets. So in January of 2018, American Angus Association published the first ever research EPDs for foot structure in the beef industry. Okay, you guys were the first ones to be able to roll out that data. We had about 12,000 foot score records in that particular data set. And basically what we did is we created an EPD for both of these phenotypes, but we ignored the 1 through 4 scores. Why did we do that? Again, because we do not see those types of animals in a large quantity to be able to predict an EPD for them. And so when you get online and you look at these research EPDs that we have out, currently we just updated your research EPD run this last week before we came to convention. And basically what you guys can see online are AI sires that have a 0.4 accuracy or above. And for those folks that raised their hand and said that they had sent in foot score data to the association, you got a nice email in your inbox this last week, right, with an Excel spreadsheet, and Mr. Bates is shaking his head yes, he received it, that basically gives you the EPDs on your individual herd. So if you're participating in this research, you already have access to some of those EPDs. But when you're analyzing those EPDs, we want to select on the more negative, right, or the smaller EPD number. Okay, because what that tells us and what that does is it moves us from a worse score, from that 9 score, down to a 5, right? We're trying to move our progeny back towards ideal. And so when we're looking at those, we need to think of these foot score EPDs in partial scores, and that we're moving the average of the progeny back to a more ideal foot score. One thing I want to point out is that if you guys continue, the way the EPD is set up today, right, in the way it will be published, is that if you continue to select on a smaller and smaller foot score EPD, you're not going to start turning your cows into 1 through 4s, okay? And I understand why that would be a concern, but because we're not using that data, right, this EPD is not going to set you up for failure, okay? So I want you guys to be aware that if you continue to select on smaller and more negative values, basically it's not going to take you to the other side of the spectrum. If in 2 or 3 or 5 years down the road, all of a sudden I see an uptick in the number of 1 through 4 scores that I'm getting into your evaluation, at that point in time, right, we'll have to do another analysis, and there may actually be another EPD that kind of looks at that 1 through 4 side of the scale. Okay, does that make sense? So if we're looking at 2 bulls EPDs, and these are bulls that would be published on that report we were just talking about, just like any other EPD, you have to compare them to another animal. The breed average right now for both foot angle and claw set is about 0.50, okay? So you can kind of think about it if you're using bulls that are above a 0.5 or below a 0.5, right? If you're below a 0.5, you're a breed improver. If you're above a 0.5, well, you're not, right? You're making the breed worse. So just like with any EPD, we can kind of look at it from an average standpoint, or you can look at it in comparison to another bull. So a more desirable bull in this case is going to be that sire B, right? Because it's the more negative or the one that's closer in the smaller number. And we're going to take this difference. Basically, what you're going to do is there's a 0.45 difference. And so on average, sire B's calves, right, not sire A, but sire B's calves, will score a half a score better, right, when we take their foot scores. And so we're moving them back towards that 0.5, and that's for both of those traits. And so when we're thinking about these, use them like any other EPD that you would, and basically we're doing it on partial scores, all right? Birth weights in pounds, foot angle and claw set EPDs are in partial scores. And so where are we at today? We started collecting these foot score EPDs in about 2015. Since that time, we did our preliminary research analysis back in the summer of 2017. We released your guys' first research EPD to 2018. Since that time, we've collected about 6,000 more scores from 160 different members, right? In addition to the 12,000 we had to work with in summer of 2017. We basically initiated that research project in February of 2018. Through that research project, we've collected 4,600 foot scores on individual mature cows, ages 2 through, I believe, 9. And the way we pinpointed those herds for that research were herds that had a lot of females genotyped, right? If we have phenotypes and genotypes on these cows, that basically makes our EPD analysis that much stronger. So basically, we updated that research run for you all back here in November. We will update it again in January of 2019. And then basically in June of 2019, what we're going to do is we're going to move this EPD from a research environment, right? So you no longer only have this stagnant list that you have to select off of, to basically a production environment, where that's when it's going to become searchable on AAA login. You're going to be able to get those EPDs on your registration papers and things of that nature. And so basically with that, that's all the slides we have prepared for you today. But we definitely like to open it up for some questions, comments, and some conversation to make sure that you guys remain comfortable with taking these foot scores and we figure out, really what is the best way and how should we continue to do this in our herds. Sure. So the question was, will the foot score EPDs be genomically enhanced? And the answer is yes. Currently, actually, your research EPDs are also genomically enhanced. So if you have that genomic data, it is being incorporated in our single-step genomic evaluation. So the question was, is the genomic EPDs being calculated from a marker that is found? So just like many of our performance traits, foot structure right now is a polygenic trait, right? So it's controlled by many, many genes in the body. So basically, we don't have just 1 or 2 markers that are influencing these particular EPDs, but what we are doing is we're strengthening that genomic relationship pedigree, right? And we would use it in the same manner that we would use it for something like birth weight or weaning weight. And so there's not just a couple of genes that have a strong effect on this, but we'll continue to research that and see if we do uncover something. Yeah, so his question is, why do we have all that mature cow data and why do we focus on the cows and not the bulls? The reason is that with that genetic analysis, basically it's tied back to your yearling contemporary groups, right? And so a lot of times we don't have large contemporary groups of data with our mature bulls. We get mature bull data in, but a lot of times it's in a contemporary group of 1. When it's like that, right, just like with any trait, a contemporary group of 1 doesn't help me explain any variation, and so they don't get used in that evaluation. But great question. Sure, so your question is, if your bulls have bad feet, isn't that a reflection of his genetic makeup? Yep. So that's a good thing. I think it's like it's any trait, right? So it's 25% heritable, right? So 25% of the variation we see is due to genetics, and then about 75% of it's due to the environment, right? What type of ground was he running on? What did he get fed? Things like that. So yeah, it would be an explanation, but with EPDs, right, it's all a comparison, right? And if I have nothing to compare them to, then that doesn't add a lot of value, unfortunately. So his question is, how correlated is foot score related to like a high yearling weight EPD? The answer I have there for you is we did run those correlations between some of our performance traits like yearling weight, weaning weight, and some of our carcass traits. And at this time, we don't find a strong correlation, but that's not saying with more data that we might uncover something. So the question is, could you evaluate those bulls coming into a bull stud, or could you not evaluate them because they're out of their contemporary groups? Obviously, I think it's a relevant trait to still evaluate for in those bull test stations, and I know there's a lot of groups that do have programs that evaluate feet. However, from a genetic analysis standpoint, if you only send 1 or 2 bulls, right, then that does eat at your contemporary group size. But perhaps you could score them before, right, or something like that. They'd probably be too young at that point, but if you score your replacement female mates, maybe that's a better option for you at that point in time. The question is, do we see any correlation between average daily gain and foot scores? We don't from a genetic standpoint, we haven't seen that correlation. Obviously, I'm sure all of you guys have had instances where bulls get fed too much or too hard too early. It might create some foot score problems. I guess I'll ask Alex and Jeff. They see a lot more cattle out in the country than I do, if you guys have any comments on that. But from an analysis standpoint, I haven't found anything yet.
Yeah, I think depending, again, how those cattle are managed would have reflection on what kind of scores we're looking at. But I think what we're trying to find is the genetic differences and separate out that environment.
Which is why that contemporary group's important. The other thing I'd like to point out on that is I get calls from members that are kind of questioning, well, you know, my neighbor down the road may score a 5 different than I will score a 5, right? But contemporary group effects should take care of that, because again, I'm looking at the variation in that contemporary group, not necessarily that I might have a more stringent scoring pattern than Jeff, right? You have to be consistent within your own contemporary groups, and that is the most important thing when you're sending this type of data into us. Yeah, so his question is, we see more differences in scores in mature females, and could structure basically, and how the structure of them cattle be influencing basically how that foot is shaped in those scores increasing, correct? And I would say, yeah, that's exactly probably what we're trying to get at, right? We only have those 2 scores, and I've oftentimes got asked, well, why don't you take scores for angle of the hip or how straight, you know, you are through the pastern and things like that. We believe with those 2 foot scores we're collecting, right, if we can correct the foot score, it's probably correcting something up high, right? And so we're actually capturing some of that structural data, and that is actually what we're trying to correct, is the structure of these animals when we're fixing the foundation. Does that make sense? Could I flip those? Yeah, I mean, I think it goes hand in hand as far as that goes. I think when we correct structure, we'll probably correct the foot. If we correct the foot, we're probably inadvertently correcting structure, right? It's an indicator of those 2. I think they're tied tightly together, which is why I don't ask you to score 7 different traits when you're taking structure traits, because 1, you wouldn't do it for me, and 2, I think we're capturing a lot of that variation with those 2 scores. Sure, so his question was, what age would I prefer the mature data coming in? And I think to Jeff's point, I think if we can get every female scored at yearling age time, and then basically I tell producers to set up a system where maybe you score all your herd, right, every 2 or 3 years, right? Because you're probably not going to get in just your 5-year-old females and score them, right, or just your 6-year-old females. But I think if you capture them, you know, at yearling time, and then maybe in a couple years score your whole herd again, then you're going to probably capture a lot of those females at 3 and 4 years of age, and I think that's ideal. And if you have the time and you can continue to collect them, we'll take repeated measures on the same cow.
Well, the question is, a vertical split hoof, are you considering that a genetic defect or an environmental problem?
Yeah, so at this time,
you can have rocks coming up through their foot. You can get a horizontal split where it breaks out. So how do you score those cows?
Yeah, so we don't have anything particular to assess those cracked hooves. We are just focused on the 2 traits that Jeff talked about. I would say that if you do have the opportunity, if you get rid of those types of cows that have those hairline cracks and things like that, report that in your disposal codes that you culled her for structure, right? And maybe make a comment that says hairline fracture, because then we can see how prevalent it is in the breed. Does that make sense? But at this point in time, we don't consider it a defect, and I don't have any evidence that would suggest that it is genetic. So his question was, do I think that a lot of the basically spread in our matured versus our yearling scores is environmental? I'm going to say that I think 25% of it's genetic and 75% of it's environmental. I think we uncover with more time, right, especially with our females as they continue to mature, we see more differences, right? I don't think it's necessarily when they're older that it's more heavily weighted towards the environment or towards genetics. Jeff, would you agree? Any other questions? Sure. So his question is, how much are we using genomics basically to influence the EPD if we don't know where the exact genes are that influence that trait? And I guess my answer to that one is through our single-step genomic evaluation, obviously it does get more heavily weighted on animals that don't have as much progeny data, right? And that's with any trait. And so the function of genomics in our evaluation currently is basically just to find animals who are more related to each other and then relate it back to the actual data and try to figure out patterns, right? And try to figure out what was actually passed down through their pedigree and what was, right, hereditary or genetic. I wish we could pinpoint every single gene for every trait.
Thanks.
Something may come up, but at this point in time, we just don't have anything.
Annual rainfall versus 6. Am I better off not?
Looks like that is time for now. We appreciate you guys being here at this portion. I think as Jeff and I were talking earlier, you know, that one take home from this is it doesn't matter if it's foot scoring or if it's your conception rates, that you can't manage anything you don't measure. And so something like this, we start to measure it, then we can start to manage it, and then from there, we can make progress on our herd. We appreciate your time again, and I can tell you that for Jeff and Kelly and I, we appreciate what every one of you do each day to let us have a job because we enjoy what we do and we like to work for you. If you ever have questions, let us know, okay?